Fog, mist, volumetrics, haze, steam, smoke, or whatever you want to call it. There's one thing I can say for sure about them, is they are undoubtedly the most underappreciated, unsung heroes of this 3D CGI VFX world, in my opinion. I mean, think about it. You have a crappy scene that looks like garbage. All you gotta do to improve it is throw in a volumetric box into it, and voila, it's suddenly a moody and cinematic scene. Or say you have a scene that has no sense of depth in it. How about you add some fog and mist into it, and bam, you now have infinite depth in that same render. And not just that, fog doesn't just have to be a secondary thought in your render, it can literally be the primary character too in a lot of them. That's how powerful this little feature can be in taking your render to the next level. But just like you, all I've ever done to get some fog and volumetrics into my 3D scenes is surround the scene with a default cube and plug in a volume shader node into its material and call it a day. But then I've also always wondered what these other controls are for then. And not just that, much simpler questions like what is the difference between a volume scatter node and the principal volume node? And what in the hell does the volume absorption node do? Even dumber questions like what if the camera was outside the volume box instead of inside the box in all my renders? Or what if I change the scale of the volume box? Will that create a difference? What if I apply the scale of that same volume box? Will that do anything? And what if I change the number of volume bounces here under the light parts tab? Just simple juvenile questions like that. But also, what if we don't use a volume box at all and apply the principal volume node to the world tab instead? And wondering how to use the volume render passes and mist passes effectively here in the compositor tab. How about fog add-ons and if they are of any use to us 3D artists? And also third-party assets like VDB Smoke and how they can be a viable option for creating localized fog. And also if they can be a fair replacement to the age-old 2D fog cards we've been using for so long now. Just things like that, things I've thought about over the years whenever I've used volumetrics in my renders before, but never had the patience to find anything about them. And believe it or not, since I was in such an experimental kind of mood, I also tried out Blender's own smoke simulation system to see if that can be useful to generate some fog and steam into your scene. So I think now, I've really been to the deep end at this point on this topic. So let me just stop blabbering and start sharing my thoughts about it all. Let's go. By the way, a breakdown of the whole short film that you saw in the beginning of the video, along with all relevant source files, will be available on the Patreon in a few days. And there's already a bunch of super in-depth tutorials and useful resources available on there already, especially the whole step-by-step breakdown of the Celsius short film that I released a few months back. So head on to the Patreon if you're interested in the behind the scenes of everything that I produce. Also, this video is sponsored by Wondershare Recover It, and also the team behind Geoscatter, the Blender add-on for scattering. And we'll talk more about Geoscatter in just a few minutes. Right now, I would like to take a few seconds to tell you a little bit about this really useful tool by Wondershare that can come in really handy to all Blender users out there, or any artist for that matter, because I'm certain we've all had instances where we have lost important project files or deleted them accidentally, or they've gotten corrupted somehow over the years, and there's usually no reliable way to recover them, and that's where a tool like Recover It can help. Wondershare Recover It supports over 1,000 file formats and can recover files lost through formatting or system crashes or even some kind of malware attacks. It can also recover corrupted video files of any widely used file format and resolution, and has enhanced recovery options for photographs as well. You can recover lost photos or corrupted security camera footages, or specifically for us Blender users, are lost source files or texture files that can very often happen when migrating source files or shifting them to a new computer or formatting an old one. So yeah, check out this wonderful tool by Wondershare from the link in the description. Back to the video now. Alright, let's finally begin. Let's start by looking into Globalized Fog first, and then we'll talk about Localized Fog in the next half of the video. And what I mean by Globalized Fog is just omnipresent fog, fog that is present everywhere uniformly. And that can be applied in two ways. You either plug in the principal volume node into the volume plug of the world tab, or you make a cube surrounding your whole scene and do the same thing here in the material tab. Now this principal volume node has a bunch of controls, and if you're like me, you almost always just do two things with it probably, which is first you lower the density on it way down, and then secondly you mess with the anisotropy a little bit. Now, according to the official Blender document, when you increase the density, you're literally increasing the number of particles in the volume that can now scatter, absorb, or let light pass through it, which I think is pretty evident here in the viewport itself. The anisotropy though has puzzled a few people, and I think it is best described in the Blender manual itself. The manual says, the anisotropy defines in which direction the light is more likely to scatter. A value of 0 will scatter it evenly, a negative value will concentrate the volume away from the light, and a positive value will concentrate the volume around the light. And that's it. And yeah, don't forget to mess with the base color of the fog too. That can darken and lighten the impact of the fog in your scene, as you can clearly see here in the viewport. So yeah, don't forget to mess with that either. And I think in most cases, that's all you're ever gonna need to have a nice atmosphere in your scene. But hey, you've got these other options here too, like the absorption color field here, which can be useful to give a nice and subtle tint to the volume that is being absorbed. And there's also these emission fields here that can make the volume emit some light too. I usually use it to bring back some light into the scene because increasing the density too much sometimes can make the scene really dark. Don't go overboard with it though. The key here is to be really subtle with it. But that's it. All these temperature and black body controls here are for fire simulations and VDB volumes, which we'll talk about in the next half of the video. But yeah, this is all you're ever gonna need to get some decent globalized fog in your 3D scene. Do know that if you add this volume node into the world tab instead, the HDRI will have no effect on the volume from that point on, and neither will the sun lamp. You can only use these other light sources or maybe some kind of mesh light sources instead. So I would suggest you stick with the volume box for most cases unless you absolutely know what you're doing. I think this is also a good time to cover what the key differences are between all the different volume nodes within Blender. The volume absorption node is for, well, absorbing light. It's good for adding some thickness to fluid materials or glass materials. So it's not so useful for our use case here on this video. The volume scatter node, on the other hand, can be very useful. It produces a nice volumetric light scattering effect without any of the absorption and tends to work equally better, if not better, than the principal volume node in most cases. But I prefer using the principal volume node because it just produces a more physically accurate result than the others. It does the scattering and absorption all together and has more options and sliders on top of that to play around with. So it's my default choice in most projects. Now there are other ways to add fog and mist into your scene too without using the volume box or the world shader nodes. You could use the mist pass option here within Blender, or people also used to use emission boxes at a point, I remember, to mimic a sense of volumetrics back in the day when Blender wasn't as efficient with volumetrics as it is now. And both these methods are great for low-end computers, especially the mist pass method. It gives you a lot of control over the fog in the post-processing stage, but we'll talk more about it at the end when we talk about the whole post-processing workflow you can follow to get the best out of your fog in your 3D scene. For now, let's finish this globalized fog section first. And actually, the only thing left to talk about now is how you can manipulate the density of this fog using some procedural textures. Now, a lot of people hate this uniform haze over their whole 3D scene, and what they like to do is plug in a noise texture or a Musgrave texture into the density of the volume node to give it a non-uniform spread. You could even animate the fog a little bit by making it 4D and keyframing this W field here. But I'll be honest, I hate the output you get from that. I hate using the noise texture in the fog. It makes the fog look so unrealistic and mechanical and procedural if not done properly. What I instead like to use sometimes is the gradient texture to create a nice transition in the fog, create a nice exponential height fog effect like you usually see in a lot of other softwares like Unreal Engine. But that's about it. I used it here in this deer scene. As you can see, there are 3 volume cubes here, one central volume cube covering the main part of the 3D scene, but also another volume cube up here in the back with a gradient texture to make the far off background completely covered in fog, and then another one here on the right to add a little bit of extra fog on the right. If I wouldn't add a gradient texture to these extra volume boxes, you would see a clear seam where the volume boxes intersect. So the gradient texture really helps to create a nice fall off. So yeah, keep that in mind. It's a nifty little trick. There are actually add-ons in the market too that make this textured volume density effect much easier. Like the All-Tab Easy Fog add-on, it has a bunch of fog presets with different textured fog effects. I love this one that mimics kind of like a thick ground effect here in the train render, so I definitely recommend checking it out if you're curious enough. There are also add-ons like Pure Sky Pro that offer a bunch of options to add different kinds of atmospheric fog and exponential height fog into a scene with just a click of a button. But I think that's it. These were what you would call the fundamentals of globalized volumetrics and the bare minimum information you need to get started with them. So let's now talk a little bit about localized fog, which just means what if you want a wisp of fog and mist in a very specific location in your 3D render and not everywhere like we saw in the last section. Like here in this mountain of pine trees, I have this nice little box of localized fog that can be used anywhere in any kind of a scene to add a bit of depth or mystique. But before we talk about that, how about I tell you a little bit about how this beautiful mountain of pine trees actually came together. See, nature can be very complex and chaotic, and to replicate that in a 3D scene isn't just about having good looking 3D models of trees and foliage, it's about being able to recreate that chaos. And nobody does that better than Geoscatter, the most famous scattering tool in the Blender community. It has a bunch of scattering options, starting from your straightforward and simple scattering presets that can do all the work for you in just seconds. But then they also have this really handy little feature called Biome Scatter too, that will give you access to even more scattering presets. They have a bunch of free biome systems available on their website to download if you want to try it all out. But what I really love about this add-on are the manual scattering controls it provides. You can literally micromanage your scattering workflow to the bone. And it completely shifts you to a different workflow when you go into the manual mode. And that's not the end. There's more distribution and culling and wind controller option right here in the end panel too for you to fidget around with after all of that. And see, what my point is, you can ignore it today, you can ignore it tomorrow. But if you are serious about 3D art, I can guarantee you're eventually gonna need geoscatter at some point. So why not get it while they're having a Black Friday sale where the add-on is 25% off its regular price. So yeah, head on to the link in the description and check this add-on out and show them some love for supporting this channel through this sponsorship. For now, let's get back to the video. The easiest way to add some localized fog in your scene, especially for something like God rays through a window, is just use a cube that only surrounds the window area and nothing else. This usually produces a much better result than covering the whole scene with a volume cube and increasing the density too high so you can get a more pronounced fog effect. Just use a cube, a window-shaped cube, and that should be enough. But you're right, that's a very small sample of use cases. So let's look at something like this, a much thicker form of localized fog. And you won't believe it, but this is literally just a procedure cloud shader that I got off of the Blender Kit add-on for free. And clouds are dense, so in order to make it look more like fog, I just decrease the density on it a little bit. And that's it. I can now have small blocks of localized fog anywhere I want. CG Matter actually has a full-on tutorial about how to recreate something like this from scratch, so you can check that out too if you want. But yeah, this is a cool effect that can be really handy in a lot of projects. But this is also definitely taking it a bit too far, I think. In most cases, believe it or not, all you're ever gonna need to get some localized fog is a 2D fog card plane. Like take for example this Steam pack by Ian Hubert. All you gotta do here is use the import images as planes add-on and import in any one of these fog animations into your 3D scene, and that's it. You've now got some really nice and memory efficient and good looking animated fog with no effort at all. Spread them around anywhere you want to create some depth or mystique. Just make sure they're always facing the camera though, so the illusion of the 2D card plane isn't broken. But that's about it. I use it all the time in all my projects, and never for a moment does it feel like a cheap, cheaty way to add some fog. It works flawlessly every single time and is way more efficient than using a bunch of volumetric boxes all the time. So download any fog pack you want from anywhere on the internet. There's a ton of them available online. That should tell you how widely used they are in the VFX and 3D industry, and plop them in any of your 3D scenes and be amazed by what a simple 2D plane can do to your 3D render. But another overkill method to add some moving localized fog into your scene is to import VDB sequences and use them instead of 2D planes. There are a bunch of free VDB files available on the Django Effects Embergen website that you could download to test it all out, or get any animated VDB sequence from anywhere on the internet, really. And to most of us, VDB files have usually meant fire and explosion. And remember I told you in the beginning of the video that these extra controls you see on the principal volume BSDF node are for VDB files? Well, let's look at them for a while here. At first, when you import a VDB file in, you'll probably just see the smoke part. In order to see the fire part, you just gotta change the temperature attribute here to the density attribute, then increase the black body temperature and the black body intensity to see some fiery explosions. But we are not here to make fire and explosions, we are here to make some smoke and fog, and Embergen is a great software for that. To create any kind of fog or steam or mist element in it, and then you import it back into Blender and use it whatever way you want. The reason why I suggest using Embergen and not Blender itself is because I tried the smoke simulation tools within Blender, and oh my god, was it a waste of time and energy. This is literally the best I could come up with after 4 days of effort. And I don't want to unnecessarily be negative about the fluid simulation tools within Blender. We all know they haven't received much love in recent times. Blender is good at a lot of things, and this just isn't one of them. And I think that's acceptable. You can't expect it to be great at everything, of course, and that's why we branch out to something like Embergen. Create smoke and fog simulation there, and use them as VDBs here in Blender, if simple 2D fog card planes aren't just doing it for you for some reason. But yeah, I think that's it. You either use this cloud generator, or 2D fog card planes, or straight up VDB files for some localized fog in your 3D scenes. And let's now finish this video off with some useful tips you can use in your volumetrics. Let's start with those stupid questions I mentioned earlier in the video. Like, does it matter if the camera is inside the volume box or not? And the answer is no, it does not. It's a simple and straightforward answer to an extremely stupid question. So I apologize for that. But the next question was actually useful, which was whether the overall size of the volume box affects the volumetrics in any way or not. And the answer is yes. Yes, it does. The bigger the box, the lesser the per square unit effect of the volume, if that makes sense. So definitely mess with the size of your volume box in tandem to the density to get the desired volume effect you're looking for. And yeah, also applying the scale of the volume box does nothing either. So I guess we have one less thing to worry about now. But one thing to definitely take care of is the number of volume bounces here under the light paths tab. The Blender manual actually clearly states that by default, the number of bounces is 0. The effect you get when rendering with 0 volume bounces is what is known as single scattering. If you want extra bounces, you're gonna have to set this value to 1, and that will definitely increase the overall haze in the render since the volume is now scattering more light. But here in this example, when I set it to 1, it made the render too muddy and too hazy and worked against the scene rather than help it. So set this value to 1 only if you really need a hazy atmosphere in your scene. I used it here in this industrial crane kind of shot because it actually made the final output better, in my opinion. So you only do it when it is actually necessary. Otherwise, the default value of 0 is going to be good enough. Another setting to take care of here in the render properties panel is the volumes tab that has these step rate fields. You hover over them and Blender clearly states that higher values decrease render times and lower values render with more detail. And this doesn't really affect low density volumes. You can only really see this effect in action with clouds and localized fog boxes as I showed you earlier. You can clearly see the difference between them too when I set this value to 1 as compared to when I set this value to 0.1. It definitely takes more time to render, but yeah, the detail is definitely there too when you set it to something like 0.1. So yeah, definitely mess with this field, especially when making thick cloud-like volumetrics. And now let's talk a little bit about the post-processing workflow. As I said before, mist pass is a great alternative to actual volumetrics, especially if you have a weak computer that struggles when rendering volumetrics. But not just that, professionals actually use mist passes all the time to have more control over the depth of their renders when in the compositing stage. You can render out a mist pass with your actual original render using this node setup in the compositor tab in Blender, and then use that in Resolve or Nuke or After Effects or Photoshop or wherever you prefer compositing. You could do it in Blender itself too if you want with this little notary setup, but I prefer taking it outside of Blender just because of the extra option that these other tools provide. But beyond mist passes, you can also generate the volume direct and indirect passes within Blender by checking these two checkboxes here in the View Layer Properties panel. These are again really helpful in the compositing stage. You can micromanage the volumetrics to your heart's content. And I'm no expert when it comes to compositing, but one simple thing you can do with these passes is just simply layer them on top of each other and set the blend mode to multiply or screen or whatever looks good to immediately increase the impact of the volumetrics. When you increase the density of the principal volume node within Blender, your scene can tend to get pretty dark. So say you need the God rays coming out from that window to be a little more pronounced, but don't want the scene to get any darker, these volume render passes can come really handy. You just layer them on top of each other in the compositor until you're satisfied with their density without ever affecting the overall exposure of the shot. And that is just one use case. You can do a lot more with them. So definitely keep them in mind for any future projects. Another great thing you can do in post is use those same fog and steam cards we used within Blender and overlay them here in post instead for some extra layers of fog detail. I did that a lot on this short film, so you gotta try it out, if nothing else from this video. The advanced version of that same workflow involves proper compositing and rotoscoping fog elements that you download from sites like Action VFX or Production Crate, like professional VFX artists do. And I'm not going to pretend to be one of them here on this channel and even pretend to know how to do any of those things. So I'll just link you to some really good tutorials I found on YouTube instead, here in the description below. And on a completely different tangent, one thing that's really worth pointing out on these fog renders is they look great in black and white. I don't know what it is about fog and the black and white aesthetic, but they just look awesome together. So if you're struggling with the color grading of your fog-based renders, just try out a black and white LUT or something. I cannot recommend it enough. Anyway, one last thing I want to point out before we end this video is fog can be very intensive on your computer. If your computer can't handle animations, I would suggest sticking with still renders because you can go much higher in the sample count and compositing fog elements in post will also become a breeze. You don't even need proper fog cards. You can cut out fog from any stock photograph and implement them straight away into your render. Actually, Gleb Alexandrov has this amazing tutorial about how to fake volumetrics in Eevee using just a flare of light, which I will link in the description below. Definitely check that video out if you're looking for some simple optimization tips. But in short, all I'm trying to say here is avoid animations if you think your computer is chugging too hard because of the volumetrics. But if you are adamant and want to experiment with animations no matter what, I would suggest using this free super image denoiser plugin that helps reduce the overall temporal denoising artifacts you get very often with Volumetrics. But do note that this also adds up to your overall render times, so it all depends on what your computer can and cannot handle. Another trick I sometimes like to use is I render my animation without the Volumetrics first, and then mask out every other collection except the volume one, and then render that out separately, and then mix them both together in post, like we did before. That can sometimes save some render times too. And yeah, I think that's it. That's all I had planned for this video, to be honest. I'm sure a lot of you guys watching must have a bunch of fog tips too, so do not forget to share them in the comment section below. I always look forward to that. And also special thanks to all the Patreon folks who help make these high effort videos a breeze, because you know how mean the YouTube algorithm can be to inconsistent creators like me. So join the Patreon if you can. I would highly appreciate it. But that's it for this video. Thanks for watching till the end if you did. I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.